In the harsh frontier of Montana Territory, 1883, where survival depended on strength and conformity, 28-year-old Luke Thompson had been written off by every decent person in 3 counties. Born with a twisted left arm that made him useless for heavy ranch work, and carrying the shame of a father who'd abandoned his family for whiskey and gambling, Luke was considered damaged goods. A man no respectable woman would marry and no serious rancher would hire. 300 miles south, in the wild mining camps of the Colorado Rockies, 24-year-old Grace O'Sullivan had earned a reputation that made proper ladies cross themselves and respectable men look away in disgust. Raised by a gambling father after her mother died birthing her, Grace could outshoot most men, outsmart card cheats, and survive in places where decent women wouldn't dare set foot. Society called her wild and unnatural, a woman who refused to know her place and therefore deserved whatever hardships came her way. When a terrible accident left Luke stranded and injured in the Colorado wilderness, and Grace found him more dead than alive beside a frozen stream, neither expected their meeting to be anything more than a brief encounter between 2 people the world had given up on. But sometimes the most beautiful love stories begin when 2 broken souls discover that what makes them worthless to everyone else makes them absolutely perfect for each other. What happened next would defy every rule of proper society and prove that homes aren't built with money or status. They're built with love, determination, and the unshakable belief that 2 people can create something magnificent from nothing but dust, dreams, and devotion. If you believe that society's rejects often become life's greatest success stories, hit that like button. Tell us about someone who saw your worth when the world couldn't, and subscribe for more stories that prove love conquers every label society tries to pin on us. The Colorado mountain wind cut through Luke Thompson's worn coat like ice-cold knives as his horse stumbled through the deepening snow. Both man and animal pushed far beyond their limits. Luke's twisted left arm throbbed with each jarring step, the deformed limb that had made him an object of pity and derision since birth, now screaming in protest against the cold and exhaustion that threatened to claim them both. He should never have attempted this journey alone, should never have believed he could make it from the failed ranch in Montana to the mining camps of Colorado without proper supplies or a reliable horse. But desperation had a way of making even the most cautious men take foolish risks, and Luke had been desperate for months. Ever since the bank foreclosed on the small homestead he'd been trying to work with, nothing but determination and a body that half the world considered broken. The people of Millerville had made their opinions clear enough over the years. Worthless Luke, they called him behind his back, sometimes to his face when whiskey made them bold. The cripple who couldn't pull his weight, the son of a drunk and a gambler, the man who'd never amount to anything because God had marked him from birth as defective. Every failed crop, every broken fence, every setback on his struggling homestead had been met with knowing nods and whispered confirmations that Luke Thompson was exactly what they'd always said he was: worthless. "Easy, girl," Luke murmured to his mare Belle as she stumbled again, her legs shaking with fatigue and cold. Belle had been his father's horse before the old man disappeared into a whiskey bottle and never came back, and she was the only living creature who'd never looked at Luke's twisted arm with disappointment or disgust. But even Belle's loyalty couldn't overcome the reality that they were both dying slowly in this frozen wilderness. The blizzard had caught them 2 days earlier, turning what should have been a straightforward mountain trail into a maze of white death that seemed determined to claim every soul foolish enough to challenge its power. Luke's meager supplies had run out yesterday morning, and his water flask had frozen solid in the bitter cold. He knew the signs of hypothermia setting in, the drowsiness that felt like peace, the confusion that made simple decisions impossible, the growing temptation to just lie down in the snow and let the mountain cold take him. Maybe that would be a mercy. Luke thought as Belle stumbled to her knees in a drift and couldn't summon the strength to get back up. Maybe dying in these mountains would be better than continuing to live as the village's worthless cripple, the man no decent woman would marry and no serious employer would hire. At least the mountains wouldn't judge him for his father's sins or his body's imperfections. At least death would be honest about its intentions, unlike the people who'd spent years telling him he had value while treating him like damaged goods. Luke slid from Belle's back and tried to help her stand, but his good arm was too weak from cold and hunger, and his twisted left arm was useless for anything requiring real strength. The horse looked at him with dark, intelligent eyes that seemed to understand they'd reached the end of their journey together, and Luke felt tears freeze on his cheeks as he realized he was about to lose the only friend he'd ever had. The sound of approaching hoofbeats seemed like a hallucination at first. No one else would be foolish enough to travel in this weather, and Luke had seen no signs of human habitation for 2 days. But the sounds grew closer, accompanied by a voice calling out words he couldn't quite make out through the howling wind. "Hey there! You need help?" Luke looked up through the swirling snow to see a figure on horseback emerging from the white chaos like something from a fever dream. The rider was small and bundled in heavy furs, but there was something about the way they sat their horse. Confident, competent, completely at ease even in these deadly conditions, that suggested this was no lost traveler, but someone who belonged in this harsh landscape. As the stranger drew closer, Luke realized with shock that the rider was a woman, a young woman with wild auburn hair escaping from her fur-lined hood and green eyes that assessed his desperate situation with the sharp intelligence of someone accustomed to making life-or-death decisions quickly and correctly. "Jesus," she said, dismounting with fluid grace and immediately moving to examine Belle with hands that clearly knew horses. "How long have you been out here?" 2 days, Luke managed through chattering teeth, his voice barely audible over the wind. "Since the storm hit. My horse, she can't go any further." The woman's hands moved over Belle with practiced skill, checking for injuries and signs of exhaustion with the thoroughness of someone who understood that in this environment, a mistake could kill you. "She's not injured, just played out completely. What about you? Any frostbite? Injuries I should know about?" Luke hesitated, his lifelong shame about his deformed arm warring with his desperate need for help. In his experience, most people's willingness to assist evaporated quickly once they realized he was defective. But looking at this woman's calm competence in the face of the storm, he decided honesty was his only option. "My left arm, it's not right. Never has been, born twisted, makes things difficult." The woman glanced at his obviously deformed limb with the same matter-of-fact attention she'd given his horse, showing neither the pity that made Luke feel like a burden nor the disgust that made him feel like a monster. It was simply another piece of information to be processed and dealt with practically. "Can you ride if I get you on a horse?" she asked. "I think so." "Good enough." She moved to her own mount with the economic movements of someone who never wasted energy, and returned with supplies that Luke recognized as professional-grade survival gear. "I'm Grace O'Sullivan. I've got a cabin about a mile from here where we can wait out this storm. Think you can make it that far?" Luke stared at her in amazement, his numbed mind struggling to process what he was hearing. Grace O'Sullivan. He'd heard that name whispered in saloons and trading posts from Montana to New Mexico. The wild woman who could outshoot most men and outwit card cheats, who lived alone in the mountains and answered to no one. The woman decent people crossed the street to avoid, and preachers used as an example of what happened when females forgot their proper place in God's order. Looking at her now, crouched in the snow beside his dying horse, Luke saw none of the wickedness or unnaturalness that people attributed to her legend. He saw competence, kindness, and the kind of practical intelligence that could keep people alive in situations where proper manners and social conventions were utterly useless. "Why would you help me?" Luke asked, his voice hoarse with cold and confusion. "You don't know me? I could be anyone." Grace paused in her preparations and looked at him with an expression he couldn't quite read, part understanding, part recognition, as if she was seeing something in him that resonated with her own experience. "Because you need help and I can give it," she said simply. "Because I know what it's like to be alone, in a world that's decided you're not worth saving, and because that horse of yours has the heart of a fighter, just like her owner, and I respect that." She helped Luke onto her spare horse with gentle efficiency, her strength surprising him as she supported his weight without making him feel helpless or burdensome. Then she fashioned a lead rope for Belle that would allow the exhausted mare to follow without carrying weight, her movements quick and sure despite the worsening conditions. As they began the slow journey toward Grace's cabin, Luke found himself studying this remarkable woman who'd appeared in his darkest moment like an answer to prayers he'd been afraid to speak. Grace O'Sullivan might be everything the respectable world said she was: wild, unconventional, dangerous to proper social order. But she was also the first person in Luke's adult life to look at his broken body and broken dreams and see something worth saving. "Thank you," Luke said as they rode through the swirling snow toward whatever shelter awaited them. "Don't thank me yet," Grace replied with a grin that transformed her face from merely pretty to genuinely beautiful. "Wait until you see how I live. Decent folks would say my cabin's not fit for civilized people." Luke managed a weak smile in return, feeling something stirring in his chest that he hadn't experienced in years. "Good thing I'm not decent folk." Grace's laughter rang out clear and bright in the frozen air, a sound of pure joy that seemed to push back against the storm's fury. And for the first time in months, Luke felt something that might have been hope beginning to kindle in his heart. Grace's cabin materialized from the blizzard like something from a fairy tale, a sturdy log structure nestled against a cliff face that provided natural protection from the wind, with a stone chimney sending steady streams of smoke into the storm as proof of warmth and safety within. But what struck Luke most powerfully was how perfectly the building seemed to fit its harsh environment, as if it had grown from the mountain itself rather than been imposed upon it by human will. "Home, sweet home," Grace said as she helped Luke down from his horse, her surprising strength supporting his weight with easy competence. "It's not much by town standards, but it keeps the weather out and has never failed to keep me alive through 6 winters up here." The interior of the cabin defied every expectation Luke had formed about how an uncivilized woman might live. The single large room was organized with almost military precision, every tool and supply in its designated place, but it was also undeniably comfortable in a way that spoke of someone who'd created a genuine home rather than just a survival shelter. Hand-sewn quilts covered a bed built into an alcove. Books lined shelves carved directly into the log walls, and the stone fireplace was clearly designed to heat the entire space with maximum efficiency. "Sit by the fire," Grace ordered, already moving toward a lean-to attached to the cabin's protected side where she could tend to the horses. "Get those wet clothes off and wrap yourself in those blankets I left out. I'll be back in a few minutes once I make sure the animals are settled." Luke obeyed gratefully, stripping out of his frozen garments with clumsy fingers and discovering that Grace had laid out dry clothes for him. Men's clothes that were slightly too small for his frame, but clean and warm, and more consideration than he'd received from most people in years. As feeling gradually returned to his extremities in waves of painful sensation, he found himself studying his surroundings with growing amazement. This wasn't the den of iniquity that people described when they spoke of Grace O'Sullivan's lifestyle, with lowered voices and scandalized expressions. It was the home of someone who'd learned to live entirely on their own terms, who'd created genuine comfort and beauty in one of the harshest environments on Earth through nothing but skill, determination, and an artistic eye that saw possibilities where others saw only problems. Grace returned 20 minutes later, stamping snow off her boots and hanging up her heavy coat, her cheeks red with cold, but her eyes bright with the satisfaction of work well done. "Your horse is tougher than she looks," she announced, moving immediately to the stove, where something that smelled like heaven itself was beginning to simmer. "She'll be fine with rest and good feed. You, on the other hand, look like you haven't eaten a proper meal in weeks." Luke realized she was absolutely right. The shame of his failures had made eating feel like an indulgence he didn't deserve, and the grueling journey through the mountains had depleted what little reserves he'd managed to maintain. His clothes hung loose on his frame, and his face had taken on the hollow-cheeked appearance of someone who'd been surviving on pride and stubbornness rather than actual nourishment. "Money's been tight lately," he admitted, his voice thick with embarrassment. "When isn't it?" Grace replied without a trace of judgment, ladling rich stew into a bowl and setting it before him along with thick slices of bread she'd obviously baked herself. "Eat. We can talk about everything else after you get some meat back on your bones." The stew was the best thing Luke had tasted in months, rich with venison and root vegetables, seasoned with herbs he couldn't identify, but which spoke of someone who knew how to transform simple ingredients into something memorable and nourishing. As warmth spread through his body and strength slowly returned to his limbs, he found himself watching Grace move around her cabin with fluid efficiency, tending to a dozen small tasks that kept her isolated home running smoothly. Every movement spoke of competence earned through years of necessity. She checked the fire, adjusted dampers, organized supplies, and maintained her living space with the kind of automatic precision that comes only from long practice. This was a woman who'd learned to depend entirely on herself, who'd created not just survival, but genuine comfort in a place where most people wouldn't last a week. "How long have you lived like this?" Luke asked when he could finally speak without his teeth chattering. 6 years, Grace replied, settling into a chair across from him with her own bowl of stew. "Since I was 18 and decided I'd rather live free and alone than married and miserable to some man who'd spend his life trying to tame me into something I'm not." "You've been alone up here for 6 years?" Luke couldn't hide his amazement. Surviving one winter in these mountains would challenge most experienced frontiersmen. Surviving 6 years alone was almost beyond comprehension. Grace's smile held both pride and a kind of wistful sadness. "Alone but not lonely most of the time. The mountains don't judge you for being different, Luke. They don't care if you wear pants instead of dresses or know how to shoot better than you can cook. They don't whisper about you being unnatural or wicked. They only care whether you're strong enough and smart enough to earn your place in them." "And you obviously are," Luke said, looking around at the abundant evidence of her competence. "Strong enough and smart enough, I mean." "So far," Grace agreed with a self-deprecating chuckle. "Though I'll admit, there are times when it gets lonely enough that I find myself having long conversations with my horse, and Belle's responses are getting more interesting every year, which probably says something about my mental state." They ate in comfortable silence while the storm continued to rage outside, the warmth of the fire and the solid walls creating a sense of safety and peace that Luke hadn't experienced in months. But as his immediate physical needs were met, other concerns began to surface in his mind. "I should probably tell you," Luke said reluctantly, his natural honesty warring with his embarrassment, "I don't have much money to pay you for this. For helping me, I mean. I can work to earn my keep once the storm passes, but I can't offer you anything valuable right now." Grace held up a hand to stop him, her green eyes studying his face with an intensity that made Luke want to look away. "Let me ask you something, Luke Thompson. And yes, I heard you telling your horse your name back there. What were you planning to do in Colorado? What brought you out here in the first place?" Luke felt heat rise in his cheeks as he prepared to admit his failures to this remarkable woman who'd already seen him at his most vulnerable. "I had a homestead in Montana. Small place, nothing fancy, but it was mine. I thought maybe if I could make it work, if I could prove myself as a farmer, I could show everyone I wasn't as worthless as they all said." What happened? "Everything that could go wrong went wrong," Luke said bitterly, the familiar taste of failure sharp in his mouth. "Disease took half my cattle. Drought killed my crops. Equipment broke down faster than I could fix it, and I didn't have the money or the connections to recover from any of it. Bank foreclosed last month. I figured maybe I could find work in the mining camps, start over somewhere. Nobody knew my history." Grace was quiet for a long moment, her intelligent eyes studying his face as if she were reading a story written there in lines of disappointment and determined hope. When she finally spoke, her words surprised him completely. "You know what I think," she said. "I think the problem wasn't that you were worthless. I think the problem was that you were trying to succeed in a world that was never going to give you a fair chance, no matter how hard you worked or how much you sacrificed." Luke stared at her, not understanding where she was leading. Grace stood and moved to the window, looking out at the storm that had brought them together with an expression that seemed to see beyond the swirling snow to possibilities Luke couldn't imagine. "Maybe Montana wasn't your failure, Luke. Maybe it was your education. Maybe everything you learned trying to make that homestead work. All the skills you developed, all the problems you solved, all the determination you built up inside yourself. Maybe all of that was preparing you for something completely different." She turned back to face him, and Luke saw something in her expression that made his heart skip a beat. It was hope, but more than that, it was recognition, as if she was seeing in him something that even he didn't know was there. "How do you feel about the idea of staying here?" Grace asked quietly. "Not just until the storm passes, but really staying. Building something with someone who understands what it's like to be different, to be judged by standards that were never fair in the first place." Luke felt his breath catch in his throat, hardly daring to believe what he was hearing. "You mean you'd want me to stay? Even knowing what people say about me? Even knowing I'm—" "You're what?" Grace interrupted, her voice carrying a gentle firmness. "Disabled? Different? Marked by circumstances beyond your control? Luke, I've spent 6 years up here proving that what people say doesn't matter nearly as much as what you actually do. You've got good hands, a strong mind, and more heart than any 10 normal men I've ever met." She paused, and Luke saw vulnerability flash across her features like sunlight through clouds. "The truth is, I get lonely too, Luke, and I think maybe we could be a lot less lonely together." Outside, the storm continued to rage with undiminished fury. But inside Grace's cabin, Luke felt warmth spreading through his chest that had nothing to do with the fire blazing in the hearth. For the first time in his adult life, someone was offering him genuine partnership instead of charity, respect instead of pity, and the chance to build something lasting with someone who saw his worth instead of his limitations. "Yes," he said simply, his voice steady with quiet conviction. "Yes, I'd like that very much." Spring transformed their world completely. Working together through winter, Luke and Grace had turned her isolated cabin into a thriving homestead. Luke's farming experience proved invaluable for mountain living, while his twisted arm, worthless for ranch work, was perfect for detailed craftsmanship. "Look at this," Grace said one May morning, standing on their new porch and gesturing toward the valley below. Neat garden terraces cascaded down the mountainside. An expanded chicken coop housed laying hens, and Luke's workshop had become famous among miners for impossible repairs. Their peaceful morning was interrupted by approaching riders, a middle-aged couple with official bearing. "You'd be Grace O'Sullivan," the man said without preamble. I'm James Whitfield, Territorial Land Commissioner. We're here about reports of improper conduct." "What kind of improper conduct?" Grace asked calmly. "A woman living alone with a man, unmarried," his wife Margaret interjected sharply. "It's contrary to public morals." Luke stepped beside Grace protectively. "I'm Luke Thompson, Miss O'Sullivan's business partner." "Business partner," Whitfield repeated skeptically. "What kind of business requires such proximity?" Grace smiled dangerously. "The kind that's built something remarkable. Would you like to see?" The tour that followed demolished every assumption the officials had made. Grace showed them Luke's workshop where his craftsmanship created furniture that was pure art. The ingenious systems they'd designed together, terraced gardens producing impossible quantities of food, and detailed records of legitimate trades. "This is impressive," Whitfield admitted grudgingly, "more sophisticated than many established homesteads. It's what happens when two people work together toward common goals," Grace replied. "We complement each other's strengths." Margaret had been quiet, but now observed, "You care for each other. It's obvious in how you work together. This isn't just business." Grace and Luke exchanged glances, seeing their own feelings reflected, love grown from respect and shared dreams. "No," Grace said quietly, "it's not just business. Luke is everything I never knew I was looking for. And Grace is the miracle that saved my life in every way that matters," Luke added. Whitfield cleared his throat uncomfortably. "If that's the case, perhaps you should make it official. Marriage would address propriety concerns." Luke felt his heart skip as he realized this was his moment. "Grace," he said steadily, "would you marry me? Not because officials think we should, but because I love you and want to spend my life building dreams with you." Grace's smile was radiant. "Luke Thompson, I thought you'd never ask. Yes, I'll marry you, and yes, we'll keep building something beautiful together." As they kissed on the porch of the home they'd created from nothing, even the territorial officials looked on with grudging respect. The wedding took place 3 months later on a perfect September morning when the aspens had turned gold. Word had spread about the couple who had transformed wilderness into prosperity, and people came from hundreds of miles to witness the marriage. A traveling preacher performed the ceremony in the meadow below their home. "I've married couples who had everything the world could offer," Reverend Hayes told the gathered crowd, "but rarely two people with more love to give each other." Grace wore green silk that matched her eyes, but it was her confidence that made her beautiful, standing beside Luke as an equal partner. Luke wore his best suit, but what struck everyone was his transformation from shame to quiet pride. They wrote their own vows. "Grace," Luke said, his voice carrying across the meadow, "when I met you, I was dying from believing what everyone said about my worth. You showed me who I really was, beneath all the labels. You saw strength where others saw weakness, potential where others saw problems. You are my miracle. I promise to spend every day proving worthy of your faith in me." Grace's vows were filled with fierce independence. "Luke, the world called me wild because I refused to let others define my limitations. I lived alone rather than be caged. But you showed me that the right partnership multiplies freedom instead of limiting it. Together, we've built something beautiful from dust and devotion. You are my anchor, my adventure, and my home." The celebration continued into evening with music and dancing. But the most meaningful moment came at midnight when they stood on their porch, looking over the land they had transformed. "Do you ever regret giving up your independence?" Luke asked. Grace laughed with pure joy. "Luke, I didn't give it up. I chose to share it with someone who makes me stronger." Years later, travelers would stop at the Thompson homestead and marvel at what two people could accomplish when they refused society's limitations. Luke's craftsmanship brought customers from across the territory, while Grace's mountain knowledge made her legendary. But more than success, they had become symbols of hope for everyone told they weren't good enough. They called him worthless and her wild, visitors would say, but together they built a home from dust and proved that love needs no permission except from the two hearts sharing it. This incredible story proves that society's rejects often become life's greatest successes when they find someone who sees their worth. Drop a comment about someone who saw your potential when the world couldn't. Hit like. If this reminded you that broken doesn't mean worthless, sometimes it means you're ready to build something new. Subscribe for stories showing how outcasts become legends and homes are built with love, not money. Share with someone who needs to remember their worth isn't determined by society's standards.